So Ulrich Beck came up with the idea of risk society. Now, for Ulrich Beck, the idea of risk society is very much related to modernity. He talks about modernity as the culmination or the beginning of risk within human development. So he also talks he gives a lot of names to modernity. For instance, reflexive modernity, late modernity, risk society. These are all the synonyms given to modernity from his perspective. He believed that as society progressed, as society evolved into a better form, and as science and technology improved, the material scarcity reduced and we had a better living standard. What happened because of this? Science and technology progressed and we gave a rational interpretation and a rational understanding to the activities and to the happenings that that occurred around us. For instance, we started giving meanings to actions, to our own actions, rather than putting blame on the nature or superstition, right? So, because science and technology developed, Ulrich Beck believed that we, on one hand, had a better living standard, we reduced material scarcity, but we also started giving meanings to our happenings. So, we entered into a risk society because the blame of the catastrophe and the risk that were happening around us were on the decision making of the individuals. So he does not confine his examination to environment. It's not just the natural environment that he is focusing on. With late modernity, we are facing certain kind of risks and catastrophes, and it does not only restrict to environment. Rather, there are other types of problems emerging, risks emerging, including terrorism, including we also have nuclear disasters. For instance, the risks around Ukraine and Russia that we are focusing upon these days, the risk of war is part of something late modernity. We cannot blame upon nature, we cannot blame upon gods as we are entering into the era of science and technology. Rather, we are focusing on human decision making that is in fact leading to certain kind of risks, right? um, so as I talked about nuclear contamination, there are toxins in the environment, there is nuclear degradation, environmental degradation, there is pollution. And so these kinds of disasters are happening, and with scientific research, we are able to kind of contextualize it, able to understand why it is happening. For instance, nuclear disasters is not an act of God. Rather, it is an act of human decision making. It is happening because certain industrialization, certain form of industrialization has happened, which is not in tandem or not in sync with the kind of life that we want, a healthy lifestyle that we want. So he stresses that these risks are not confined to particular social groups. Rather, it is very interesting that these risks are, this kind of a risk is somewhat has disseminated throughout the society. Everybody is vulnerable. Everybody is facing that crisis. So these are, and because of this there is also this decline of social class. A lot of scholars would differ on this, especially Weberians and Marxists would differ on this, because Weberian sociology talks about the social class stratification theory based upon social class. But Beck would say that there is a decline in the importance of social class, and that is why we are entering into late modernity or post modernity, because class is something that as a form of social inequality or as a framework of social stratification has somewhat diminished, right? So if we try and give an example for Beck, the very interesting example would be pandemic. Like, the pandemic impacted every class. Nobody was nobody came out of it untouched. It was a disaster, it was a risk that everybody faced. It was a catastrophe that everybody encountered. There were deaths in every class. Now, obviously, social stratification, a functionalist would, a lot of conflict theorists would definitely say that Definitely class has an impact, had an impact, because the kind of disaster that happened for the social class of the lower strata was much bigger as compared to the higher class. But nevertheless, Beck would say that the importance of class is diminishing, because risk is something which is universal. It is across all social groups, it is across all social classes, and therefore the idea of social stratification in form of social class is somewhat diminishing. His another point was that people are into the form of, or into the phase of, reflexive modernity. What does it mean by that? That we are becoming more aware of the problems that are caused by modernity, right? So people who are criticizing Ukraine-Russia war, or people who came up with the ideas, with critical ideas of pandemic, they know where the problem lies. Where when we talk about environment, and we are criticizing the way in which industrialization and urbanization is happening, we are becoming more aware. We are becoming self-reflective as Beck would say. So we are reflecting it with the kind of problems that we are facing, with the human decision making that is going wrong. And that is why he calls this latest phase of modernity as a reflexive modernity. He again talks about, there are a lot of kind of risks that are growing and becoming global, and it is very difficult for individual nation states to handle, and that is why these risks are also called global risk society, or world risk society, because it is not restricted to a nation state. For instance, when we are, again I'm pointing out to the recent geopolitics of Russia-Ukraine war, is something that everybody is involved. Most of the nation states are involved. The threat of nuclear war and the threat of catastrophe to nations which are closer to Ukraine, for instance Europe, is again is a global affair. Asian nations are also facing the threat of war. Now, China is also, China. The whole idea that China may also take advantage of the rising crisis is also a threat to nearby nations. So this is what he said, that the risks that are happening is not restricted to a nation state, but it is becoming global, and that is why he says it is a world risk society. Next, he tries to distinguish between the idea of risk and catastrophe. Now, the distinction is primarily in terms of the fact that catastrophe is something which is happening when the risk has been staged, when the actual risk has occurred, right? It is called as catastrophe. Whereas a risk is basically speculative possibility, when there is a chance of happening. The word is at risk, it means that there is a anticipation, there is a global anticipation of a risk happening. For instance, right now we have a global anticipation that there would be a nuclear war, and this is what Beck would say, that when there is always an anticipation of future events that may occur and threaten us, there is a speculation of a possibility. It is known as risk. Whereas catastrophe is right now. The pandemic happened at one point of time, and it was a catastrophe. This is what he means by risk and catastrophe. Then he also looks at the cultural perception of risk, and he believes that when there is also this idea of local vulnerability. So there are places which would be more vulnerable, right, as compared to other places. For instance, when we talk about environment, it is always believed that lowland areas and coastal regions would be much vulnerable as compared to regions which are far away from the coastal regions. So definitely there is a cultural perception also, and when the risks happen, it is also relative. It is not, definitely it is universal, because each and every country is getting impacted, each and every social group is getting impacted, but still there is a local vulnerability. There are measures that needs to be taken in order to reduce the risks, and these measures would also vary from geographic point of view, from the cultural point of view, from the national point of view, from the geopolitics point of view. So this is what he means by the local vulnerability and the cultural perception. Then he goes on to say that it is definitely, we need a cosmopolitan material politics here, we need a global geopolitics here, because to tackle any kind of risk we need a global cooperation. And nowadays, when so this late modernity is somewhat also a global a feature of globalization, because we are getting so much interconnected. There's so much withering away of the states because of the geopolitics, that we need, the risk cannot be handled individually. For instance, the Ukrainian crisis cannot be handled individually. The crisis that we are facing in term that we faced in terms of pandemic could not be handled by individual nations. We needed global cooperation. We needed institutions like WHO to perform their jobs in a much better way. So this is what Ulrich Beck's rudimentary idea on risk society is what I would share with you. That risk society is something which happens in a post-modern era. It is a functionality of the late modernity. The idea of how the idea of risk and catastrophe is different. Catastrophe is something that occurs in the present, whereas risk is the speculation of its happening in somewhat future. Then how it is a world at the risk world risk society or a global risk society, because we are getting so much interconnected. And then there is also this withdrawal of the nation states, and there is a cultural perception, and local vulnerability is also involved, and it varies from region to region, but definitely the risk as such is very much universal. And how we are also becoming a reflexive society, because we are getting more aware of our issues.